If you look at many manufacturers and their watch designs, many of them are going to look back to a previous period in their archive and offer up a new edition with a twist working off that pre-existing design language. I call this almost vintage-inspired timepieces. Now, this isn't a universal term, but things that take vintage elements and then really allow it to live in a modern execution. In this video, I want to look at some of my favorite different vintage-inspired watches. I've done something like this looking at specific categories like dive watches, but I want to look at a wide variety of styles and types of watches to just give you some different looks and potentially great offerings in each of those categories. So all different price ranges here. We're going to at least do a low, sometimes a medium and a high for where it's appropriate. So I just want to make sure that we have different categories, but also different price ranges represented. And as always, I can't cover all watches here. So you might be saying, hey, why didn't he include this? Why didn't he include that? Just don't want to have this video be hours long. So just keep that in mind. Don't get mad if you see something here. I had to make the cutoff somewhere. And of course, we could do a future episode of this down the road if you guys do enjoy this style of video. Now, before we jump in, definitely check out the pre-owned section on teddybaldassarre.com. New pre-owned models coming in every single week. All of them are authenticated, tested in-house, and all the pieces are curated as well by our team, really trying to match up what I think is a general interest of all of you guys, as well as myself, and the pieces that I like, and trying to make them available at solid prices, or at least find very good examples of these models. Also, there is a sell page on the site. Fill it out if you are looking to move on from your watch, and if it's a good fit for a program, one of my colleagues will be in touch. Pre-owned watches, teddybaldassarre.com. Now for our first category here, we have the Swiss Army knife, not starting with the Swiss watch, ironically, but that everyday category is really something that you can wear anywhere, anytime, and has these specifications to match, so you're never going to be in a tough situation where your watch can't handle what you're throwing at it. For the first category here, we have Seiko with the SPB 243. So this is a newer creation from Seiko, more the latest from the Alpinist line. It follows that Laurel Alpinist DNA from the 1950s, that classic field watch style. And I would say of the three, probably my least favorite in terms of the one for my own personal taste. That said, this still has its own appeal. And I think when you're talking about maybe versatility, this is the strongest of all of the different Alpinist models. It comes in right around the same price as many of the others, around that $700 price range, 38mm case, 46.2mm lug to lug, 200 meters of water resistance, so pretty typical Alpinist over manufacturing there with the water resistance in that department, sapphire crystal, and a variety of different dial colors to choose from. This has these 6R35 movements with that 70-hour power reserve to go along with it. But despite these maybe lacking the amount of charm as some of the other Alpinist models, I do think from a versatility standpoint, and also really keying in on that kind of mid-20th century field watch from Japan, this makes it a great way to start out the list. Moving along to the middle tier, we have my favorite model from Oris, and that is the Oris Big Crown Pointer Date family. Now this watch to me has such breadth in terms of what is being delivered here. You have different case styles, different dial colors, bracelet, no bracelet options. Now also getting variety of different case sizes. We saw the introduction of a 38mm version of these Big Crown Pointer Dates, which I think is very interesting. 40mm, 36mm also being there. But I think this kind of coin edge bezel with the cathedral hands, the pointer date complication, it just has all this vintage charm. And this line goes back 80 years in terms of its production. So there's history here, and I think is probably the most vintage feeling, minus the Diver 65 from this brand. I think those are the two strongest kind of vintage inspired pieces from Oris. But this is my personal favorite because I think it hits in a mark with the complication and its looks that's just different than other things that are out there. There's so many dive watches out there that makes it harder for the Oris Diver 65, but this one just feels a little more solidified as a unique offering. Although it's not going to have 100 meters of water resistance, it still should be suitable for the everyday, maybe leaning a tad more to the dressier side of things. But with that complication, again, handset, and just overall execution with the case and that coin edge bezel, it just comes together to really provide some vintage charm. Now to close out our everyday category and thinking about vintage inspired. Now some people might have an issue with me putting this watch on the list for a variety of reasons, but mostly, is it really vintage inspired? And the watch I'm talking about here is Rolex with the Explorer, the 124270. Now the reason why I wanted to include this, and just hear me out, for one, the Explorer line. If I have to think of a model from the modern context of Rolex that has been the least changed and still remains true to the formula, especially now with this latest reference, I think I'd have to look at the Explorer. You look at a vintage Submariner versus a contemporary Submariner, it just kind of feels different. It's not really the same approach. When I look at a vintage Explorer, outside of say the tritium and some of the printed elements on the dial, I do think that it still has a similar DNA, and this is the DNA that really was the foundation for all other sports watches from Rolex to really allow them to ascend. So with that all considered and moving this back to 36 millimeters, I still think that this is probably one of the more appropriate stretch types of everyday watches that makes a lot of sense here. This is easily still one of my favorite watches that Rolex makes. It is a tad more blingy. I actually have a review looking at this watch compared to the previous 214 270 from Rolex, but it's still with that 36 millimeter form factor, the classic design that has just kind of been solidified by the Explorer over the years. It's as timeless as it can be. And given that there's no true external rotating bezel on this, it does have a tad more charm. It doesn't fall victim to the ceramic kind of madness that has happened with many of the sports models that allows it to feel a little bit more vintage compared to some of their other offerings. Now we're moving on to the dive watch category, and some of these are going to be low, medium, high in what order, but for this one, I almost want to lead with just the thing that feels the most appropriate to mention in the category, and that's the Tudor Black Bay 58. Tudor, with their heritage in dive watches, certainly cannot be overlooked. Looking at the big crown Submariners from the 1960s and 70s and the Tudor Snowflakes, this is essentially a combination in its new model DNA, and I almost see Tudor as two brands. You have pre-Black Bay era versus Black Bay era and beyond. In the last 10 years, the brand has completely shifted, in my opinion, on what they're seen as in the market. They're producing some fantastic watches. Far gone are the days where they're making those hydronauts and some of those less than, I would say, pleasing designs out there. So this, to me, is almost a turning point, at least the Black Bay family, but the 58 for other reasons outside of just the looks itself. Of course, looking at the classic gilt version, I think that original one is going to be the most vintage in its approach. That, to me, was the one that felt, at the time, almost set the tone for the Black Bay 58 being this heritage or retro style diver. It's very interesting with all of these different precious metal options now becoming unveiled. The Black Bay 58 in many ways is less of a retro piece than it was when it initially was launched. Like the gilt dial was very much on the nose, kind of going after that classic Submariner look from years prior, but now the recent ones are appealing to something different. Losing the gilts and kind of that type of styling has allowed them to feel a bit more modern in comparison. So that original Black 58, I think, is probably going to be maybe the best vintage inspired dive watch that you're going to find for under $5,000. Now for vintage inspired divers, I also wanted to look at different types of dive watches, looking at something from the compressor style family. And if I'm thinking of what are brands that come to mind when thinking of those classic kind of EPSA style cases from back in the day, who was making them and who's doing a really good job from a modern context. And you can think about a brand like JLC, but if I have to look at a brand that I think falls in a great range of price and also doing a nice job of looking back to the past, I think you have to look at Longines with the Legend Diver. This, to me, and where it's sitting in the market, if you're going for this style of dive watch, it allows it to separate from the market. There's some great micros that are also doing things like this, like Baltic, for example, but I'd rather go for kind of the more real thing with Longines and their heritage and history, actually producing these watches in the mid-20th century. Now you have a variety of different styles to go for. You can go for the bronze cases. I would say the most vintage feeling is this kind of tropical, aged-looking dial, kind of this reddish-brown dial Legend Diver. As mentioned, these dials would be really like those tropical dials. They'd be sitting out in the sun year after year and having this patina age over time. One thing about these watches that I will mention, sure, you're getting some great water resistance. This is very thin on the wrist. I love just how just the thickness of these are just perfect. Not adding a lot of just top heaviness that some divers can have. But the lug to lug in many of these watches is going to wear very true to that 42 millimeter size, if not longer. So that's something to keep in mind. There is a 36 millimeter option if you want to go for the traditional heritage model that is kind of marketed more as a woman's watch, but totally unisex in my opinion. I would not be afraid to do it. And with the lack of an external rotating bezel, it wears slightly larger with that dial to bezel ratio, so it's kind of nice to see. And to round out our trio, we have the Omega Seamaster 300. Now, so many people are talking about the professional diver 300 meter from Omega, but for me, I think this is really what I love from their Seamaster family the most, outside of the Aquaterra. But if you're getting down to like the Seamaster 300, this is really what I like from this model DNA. It appeals to the 1957 versions. It also is going to have this more vintage inspired appearance, kind of the sandwich-esque style dial, and now was recently upgraded to actually have some improvements to the case and wearability, both from the lug to lug end as well as the thickness, which make these way more appealing in my opinion. This actually wears closer to that now of a 40mm dive watch, which is great. You're also getting the blue dial variant that is going to be available in stainless steel. Previously was just in titanium, which is very nice. 300 meters of water resistance and the automatic Omega 8912 caliber inside a coaxial movement. I don't want to say that these are overlooked, but they definitely don't get as much love as the Diver Professional 300 meter. But to me, again, just probably some of the best vintage inspired dive watches you're going to find. Very different than that of a Rolex as well, when you're talking about just all the ceramic upgrades and just kind of how more flashy they can be from their dive watch category. This is really true to kind of that mid 20th century design, and I think they do it really well. Now let's move on to the chronograph category. And the first one here is going to be the Seagull 1963. So with a date like 1963 in your name, you probably would assume that this is going to have some vintage appeal looking back to the 1960s, and you would be correct. That would be exactly what this one is going for. The dial in its approach has this golden hue to it from the central surface, the markers. Everything has this age look about it, but the reason why I also want to put it in this video is, of course, it's probably the most complicated looking watch that you're going to find in this price range, around $300-400. I mean, we're talking about a mechanical hand-wound chronograph movement with a column wheel for this price range. It's absolute madness. And when you flip this movement around, yes, it's not going to have all the small attention to detail. There's going to be some marks on many of these movements. It's not perfection, but in terms of the complexity, being able to see the center wheel, the levers, the chronograph train, all unobstructed by a rotor in this price range is absolute madness. Mechanically speaking, yes, this is going to be a watch you're not going to service if anything does happen to it. So just keep that in mind. This is going to be a complex service if you do buy this thing. Just have the right intention when you are looking at this watch. But mechanically speaking, also, you're really not gonna find anything more complex for around $300-400. It's also pretty interesting to look at if you've never seen one of these manual wound chronograph movements on full display. Next up, we have Tag Heuer with the Monaco Caliber 2. When I think of Tag Heuer, actually the first model that comes to mind is going to be the Monaco. Not because it's my favorite model in the world, but just because it's such a recognizable design. There really isn't anything like it fully from the luxury perspective, or really from any level of watchmaking, honestly. The square style case is a unique wearing experience when on. It's almost, the dimensions just don't tell the full story. You put this on, it says 39mm, lug to lug of 47.7, but it's just a strange wear on the wrist that makes it kind of optically, when you look down, you have to give yourself a moment to really understand what is going on. You got the Steve McQueen connection, all the different racing style inspiration that this watch has and pedigree that this watch has, and getting a Swiss column wheel chronograph movement on the inside with the Caliber 02. It's no question polarizing, but for the ones that actually do enjoy it, and when you're talking about vintage inspired, it's one that needs to be considered quickly. Now for our first watch in the dress category, we have the Hamilton intra-matic Champagne. So the intra-matic line, both from the chronograph perspective as well as the dress watch perspective, are both going to have that vintage appeal. This watch, unlike many in the price category, does a couple things. One, just the look and the typography on the dial is going to evoke that vintage mid-20th century design. The lack of a second hand, it also just has a different type of appeal. Wearability on this one is also going to be towards that end when you have 38mm with the case size and a lug to lug just under 44mm. Gonna wear very true to that 38mm case, if not a little bit smaller. This also has the automatic ETA 2892 inside, which is a great movement for the price category. Many of the pre-existing Hamilton watches under $1,000 are using ETA 2824 architecture, and then of course reducing the beat frequency and having some modifications in the process. This isn't going to have the same upgrades with the power reserve, but the ETA 2892, thinner type of architecture and utilized by a lot of premium manufacturers as a base for those that are using these ETA style movements in the luxury segment. Next up, we have Glashütte Original with their 60s dress watches. When I think of 1960s dress watches, this is exactly what comes to mind. You think of these style, the Timex Marlin, which is going to strongly emulate what is being produced here. You have the Arabic style numerals, the thin and blunted style minute and hour hands. These watches come with the automatic Geo 3952 movements, which are very well crafted, well produced movements that also look the part for the price range. Geo just makes fantastic movements for the price category. There also were some less popular lines with more eccentric dial executions in like orange and green that almost just add on top the retro flair that these watches are strongly evoking. And to round out our dress category for our reach goal, we have the Vacheron Constantin Historique 1921. This one's looking back to the early 1920s with the shift to drive watches in the expanding US market. This line was reintroduced in the past 12 years and has now seen many different iterations with different precious metal options, different boutique editions, but is, I would say, when you're talking about the epitome of a drive style watch with the offset orientation, maybe class leading and really sets the tone. When I think of Vacheron, what is the style of watch? Every brand has their kind of iconic design style that is really exclusive to them, but this silhouette, this orientation, it just reminds me of Vacheron. And although this might not be the most popular watch at the moment, and as like say the overseas, just given all the popularity around sports pieces, this is the type of style and design next to like the Corne de Vache with those horn style lugs that really just allow me to think of what is classic Vacheron on display from a modern context. Those Arabic numerals that almost look like inky black strokes of calligraphy that are just printed on the dial, just so beautiful. The 4400 movement really sets the tone for, I would say, that entry-level dress watch caliber. It's going to have an offset orientation to allow it to work with the dial design and the sub-seconds. But one of my favorite watches, very unique, and certainly evokes a lot of the feelings that this video I think we're trying to get across with that vintage styling. But all right, guys, that is my video looking at some different vintage inspired watches, different categories, different price segments. If you guys did enjoy the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Really would appreciate that. Also, if you like doing a deep dive into some of these vintage inspired watches, you want to see more of this, I can happily do another video like this. There are endless possibilities when kind of building out these categories and what you can include. So be happy to do that in the future. If you guys do want to see that, you can of course just give it a thumbs up, and that's a great indication for me. Also be sure to check out teddybaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer, 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all of the new products that we carry. And definitely check out the new pre-owned section with new models coming in every single week. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I'll see you all very soon.